You are listening to HOA Craze. I wish this was exaggerated. You are going to stop wasting my time. Susan Wright was pointing at a single fence panel, leaning against my garage in the driveway, her face already red, her voice climbing toward a scream. I had been home from my building inspection job for maybe 20 minutes, long enough to change into a t-shirt and grab a glass of water, and now she was on my property telling me that staging materials was blight, and I needed to move everything immediately or face an emergency fine. I live in Duluth, Minnesota, in a neighborhood called Parkside Estates Association, and this HOA has decided that anything within sight of an easement is their business. I am a building inspector, so I know code versus HOA nonsense, and this was nonsense. The fence panel had been there for 2 hours while I waited for my contractor to finish another job and come back to install the rest of the boundary fence I was legally allowed to build. Susan did not care. She had a key ring with too many keys jingling loudly in her hand, and a clipboard tucked under one arm, and she was already talking over me before I could finish a sentence. She said the staging was creating visual clutter and violated the landscaping standards under Section 9 of the Covenants. I asked her which line in Section 9, and she did not answer. She just repeated that I needed compliance today, or I would receive a $200 emergency fine and a notice of non-compliance hearing. I told her the fence panel would be installed by tomorrow and asked why this required an emergency designation. She said because the board had received complaints. I asked who complained, and she said that was confidential. I said the complaint was probably her, and she smiled and said it did not matter who filed it, the violation was confirmed. I felt my chest tighten because I knew where this was going. I have a custody and visitation routine with my daughter, and the HOA keeps targeting my schedule and my guests. 2 months ago they sent me a notice claiming my ex-wife's car was parked illegally during a pickup, even though it was on the street and not blocking anything. Last month they complained about noise during a weekend barbecue that ended at 7 in the evening. Now this, Susan is the social committee chair, but she shows up to every enforcement meeting with a rolled up survey map she drags around like a prop, and she has made it clear she does not like me. She slapped the clipboard against her palm and said I had until 5 that afternoon to move the materials or the fine would be automatic. It was 3:30. My contractor Ray was finishing a deck install across town and had told me he would be back by 4 to finish my fence line. If I moved the panel now, I would have to move it back in 30 minutes, and Ray's truck was already loaded with the posts and hardware. I told Susan that was unreasonable and asked if she had photos of the violation. She said she did, and she pulled out her phone and showed me a picture. The angle was wrong. It was not taken from the street or the easement. It was taken from my backyard, looking toward the driveway. I stared at the screen and then looked at her. I asked where she was standing when she took that photo. She said that was not relevant. I said it absolutely was relevant, because the only way to get that angle was to walk through my side gate into my fenced backyard without permission, which is trespassing. Her face changed for a second, a flicker of something defensive, and then she recovered and said she had the right to document violations from any vantage point necessary for enforcement. I told her that was not how property rights work, and she said if I had a problem with HOA procedure, I could file a complaint with the board. I said I would, and she smiled again and said good luck with that. The board meets once a month and they have a 3-week backlog. I realized right then that this was not about the fence panel, this was about control. Susan wanted me to panic, pay the fine, and fall in line. But I am a building inspector, and I know how to document everything. I pulled out my own phone and took a photo of her standing in my driveway, and I told her I was filing a trespassing complaint with the police and a formal records request with the HOA for all enforcement actions against my property in the last 6 months. She laughed and said, "Make it public. I love watching people get embarrassed." That line stuck with me. She said it like she had said it before, like she enjoyed it. I did not respond. I just nodded and walked back into my house, and she stood there for another minute yelling that the fine was coming and I should not waste her time with complaints that go nowhere. Ray showed up at 4:10 with his truck and a helper, and we started installing the fence. The property line was clear. I had the survey from when I bought the house 3 years ago, and I had marked the corners with stakes the week before. The HOA covenants allowed a 6-foot privacy fence as long as it was set back 2 feet from the actual property line, which mine was. Ray drilled the first post hole, and we dropped the post in and poured concrete mix. By 4:30 we had 2 posts in and the first panel up. Ray was moving fast because he had another job starting early the next morning, and if we did not finish today, I would lose my spot on his schedule for at least 2 weeks. That was the time pressure. I needed this fence done now because my daughter was coming for her week, with me starting Friday, and I wanted the backyard secure and private before she arrived. The HOA had made comments before about her being too loud when she played outside, and I was not giving them another opening. At 5:15, my phone buzzed. It was an email from the Parkside Estates Association Management Company with the subject line, Emergency Fine Notice. I opened it and saw a $200 fine for staging materials and a second notice claiming I had missed a mandatory pre-construction hearing that was required before any fence installation. I stared at the screen. There was no hearing. I had submitted my fence plan to the Architectural Review Committee 6 weeks ago and received written approval. I still had the email. I forwarded the approval email back to the management company and said the fine was invalid and I wanted an immediate response. 10 minutes later, Susan called me. Not the management company, Susan. She said the approval I had received was preliminary, and that final approval required an in-person hearing, which I had been notified about 3 weeks ago. I said I never received any notice. She said it was sent to my mailing address on file. I said my mailing address is my house address, and I check my mail every day. She said, if I did not receive it, that was my problem, not the HOA's, and the fine stood. I asked for a copy of the notice. She said it was in the file, and I could request it through the formal records process. I said I already filed a records request this afternoon. She said great, then I would get it in 30 days. I hung up and called my friend Marcus. Marcus is a CPA, and he has been helping me review my HOA financials because I have been suspicious for months that the fees are not matching the services. He answered on the second ring, and I told him what was happening. He said it sounded like retaliation and asked if I had documentation of the original approval. I said yes. He said good, keep everything, and start a timeline document with dates and communications. He also said he would look at the HOA ledger again, because he had noticed some red flags in the way fines were being recorded. I thanked him, and went back outside. Ray had 3 more panels up and was working on the 4th. The sun was low and the heat was still brutal, and I could see sweat running down his neck. I grabbed him a water bottle and told him what was happening. He shook his head and said HOAs are the worst, and he had another client last year who got fined for having a portable toilet on site during a bathroom remodel. We kept working. By 7 we had the fence finished. 10 panels, all level, all aligned with the survey stakes, all set back the required 2 feet. Ray packed up his truck and said if the HOA gave me any more trouble to call him because he had photos and notes from the install. I thanked him and paid him, and he drove off. I stood in the backyard and looked at the fence. It was exactly what I wanted. Solid, clean, and totally legal, and I knew Susan was going to come after it anyway. The next morning I woke up to another email. This one was from an attorney. The subject line said, legal notice of violation and demand for immediate action. I opened it and started reading. The letter claimed that my fence installation violated multiple covenants including height restrictions, setback requirements, and unapproved materials. It demanded that I remove the fence within 72 hours or face a lawsuit and a lien on my property. The letter was full of bluff language meant to scare me into paying instantly and tearing everything down. I read it twice and then called the attorney's office. The receptionist said the attorney was not available and I should respond in writing. I said I wanted to know what specific measurements they used to determine the violations. She said that information would be provided during litigation if necessary. I said there was not going to be litigation because the fence was legal and I had proof. She said she would pass along my message. I hung up and immediately called Marcus again. Marcus said the attorney letter was a pressure tactic and that I should not respond directly to the attorney. Instead, I should respond to the HOA board in writing with my proof and demand a retraction of all fines and notices. He also said he found something in the ledger. There were 3 enforcement fines recorded against my address in the past 6 months, but I had only received notices for 2 of them. The 3rd fine was dated 5 weeks ago and listed as paid, but I never paid it and never received a bill. He said, it looked like someone was creating phantom fines to inflate the enforcement numbers, which would make the board look more active and justify their budget. I felt my stomach drop. I asked Marcus if he thought Susan was behind it. He said he did not know, but the timing lined up with when she became social committee chair and started attending enforcement meetings. I drafted a formal response to the HOA board. I attached the original fence approval email, photos of the survey stakes, Ray's invoice with the specifications, and a copy of the city code showing that my fence met all legal requirements. I also included a paragraph about the trespassing photo and demanded that Susan provide documentation of her authority to enter my property for enforcement purposes. I sent the email to the entire board, the management company, and Susan directly. Then I waited. 2 days later, I got a call from my neighbor Bill. Bill is retired and spends most of his day working in his garage, and he has a clear view of my property from his driveway. He said Susan had been at my fence that morning with a tape measure and a camera, and she was measuring from the wrong point. I asked what he meant. He said she was measuring from the easement edge, not from the property line, which made the setback look shorter than it actually was. I asked if he saw where she started the measurement. He said yes, and he took a photo of her doing it because it looked suspicious. I told him to send me the photo immediately, and he texted it to me 5 minutes later. The photo showed Susan crouched at the fence with a yellow tape measure stretched toward the easement marker, and the angle made it obvious she was measuring wrong. I saved the photo and added it to my timeline document. That afternoon I received another email from the management company. This one said the board had reviewed my response and determined that my fence approval was preliminary only, and that I had failed to attend the required final hearing. The email included a scanned copy of a hearing notice dated 3 weeks ago with my address on it. I looked at the scan closely. The notice was printed on HOA letterhead, but the formatting was off. The font did not match other HOA notices I had received, and the date stamp in the corner was smudged. I forwarded the scan to Marcus and asked him to look at it. He called me back an hour later and said the notice looked fake. The metadata on the PDF showed it was created 2 days ago, not 3 weeks ago. Someone had backdated it. I felt a cold rush of clarity. The HOA had altered the records after the fact to justify the fines and the attorney letter. That was fraud. I called the management company and asked to speak to the property manager. When she answered, I told her I had evidence that the hearing notice was fabricated and that I was filing a formal complaint with the state HOA regulatory board and considering legal action. She went quiet for a moment and then said she would escalate my complaint to the board president. I said the board president needed to respond in writing within 48 hours, or I would assume the board was acting in bad faith. She said she understood, and hung up. That night, I reviewed my doorbell camera footage. I have a camera on my front porch and another on my side gate, and I went back through the recordings from the past month. I found 3 clips of Susan on my property. The first was from 2 weeks ago, standing in my driveway taking photos of my recycling bins. The second was from 10 days ago, walking through my side gate into the backyard without knocking or announcing herself. The third was from the day of the fence panel incident, the same trespassing photo she had shown me on her phone. In the video, you could hear her voice clearly. She was talking to herself, saying that I was going to regret ignoring the rules, and that she was going to make sure I paid every fine. I saved all 3 clips and burned them to a USB drive. The next day, Susan sent me a text message. It was short and direct. She said, "I do not need your explanation, I need your payment." That was her catchphrase. She had said it to me twice before in person, and now here it was in writing. I screenshotted the text and added it to the file. Then I texted back and said I was not paying anything, and that I had evidence of trespassing and records tampering. She did not respond. If you are enjoying this story, please hit the like button and subscribe for more wild HOA drama and neighborhood justice. 2 days later, I received a notice in the mail that the board had scheduled a special hearing to review my fence and the alleged violations. The hearing was set for the following Tuesday at 6 in the evening, which was during my daughter's week with me. I immediately sent an email asking to reschedule because the time conflicted with my custody arrangement. The management company replied that the hearing time was final and that failure to appear would result in a default judgment and automatic fines. I forwarded the email to my attorney, a guy named Colin I had used for my home purchase, and asked if the HOA could legally refuse to reschedule a hearing that conflicted with the custody order. Colin said probably not, but he would need to review the covenants. He also said the evidence I had gathered so far was strong, and that if the board proceeded with bad faith enforcement I could file for damages and attorney fees. I decided to go to the hearing. My ex agreed to pick up our daughter an hour earlier that night so I could make it, and I showed up at the community clubhouse at 5:55 with a printed binder of all my evidence. The hearing room was small, just a folding table and 6 chairs, and the board was already seated when I walked in. Susan was sitting at the far end with her rolled-up survey map on the table in front of her. She looked at me and smiled. The board president, a man named Greg, opened the hearing by reading the violation list. He said my fence exceeded the allowable height by 4 inches, was installed without final approval, and was positioned too close to the easement. I asked him to provide the measurements used to determine those violations. He looked at Susan, and she pulled out a sheet of paper and slid it across the table. The sheet had handwritten numbers and a rough sketch of my yard. I looked at the sketch and immediately saw the problem. She had drawn the property line in the wrong place. I pulled out my survey and unfolded it on the table. I pointed to the actual property line and showed where the fence was positioned. Greg looked at the survey and then at Susan's sketch and said they needed to verify the measurements. Susan jumped in and said the survey I was using was outdated and that the easement boundaries had changed since the community was developed. I asked her to provide documentation of the easement change. She said it was in the county records. I said great, let us pull the county records right now, and I opened my laptop and logged into the county assessor's website. I pulled up the parcel map for my property and the easement plat. The boundaries matched my survey exactly. I turned the laptop around so the board could see. Greg looked uncomfortable. One of the other board members, a woman named Ellen, asked Susan if she had verified the easement location before filing the violation. Susan said she had, but she did not provide any proof. I let the silence sit for a moment, then I said I had additional evidence that I wanted to submit. I pulled out the USB drive with the doorbell footage and asked if the board had a way to play video. Greg said they did not, but I could describe what was on the recordings. I said the recordings showed Susan trespassing on my property on 3 separate occasions, including entering my backyard without permission to take enforcement photos. I said I also had evidence that the hearing notice sent to me had been backdated and fabricated, and that the metadata proved it was created after the fact. Susan's face went pale. Greg asked me to submit the evidence in writing and said the board would review it and issue a decision within 10 days. I said that was not acceptable. I said the board had already demonstrated bad faith by altering records and ignoring my proof, and I was not going to wait another 10 days for a rigged decision. I said I was prepared to file a lawsuit for harassment, trespassing, and fraudulent enforcement, and I had an attorney ready to proceed. Ellen looked at Greg and said they needed to table the hearing and consult with their own attorney. Greg agreed and said the hearing was continued pending legal review. Susan tried to object, but Greg cut her off and said the decision was final. I walked out of that hearing knowing I had rattled them, but I also knew Susan was not going to back down without a bigger hit. Over the next week, I got 2 more letters from the attorney and another email from Susan claiming I was interfering with HOA business. I ignored them all and focused on my records request. 30 days after I filed it, I received a response from the management company. It was a PDF packet of board meeting minutes and enforcement logs for the past year. I opened the file and started reading. On page 12, I found something that made my pulse spike. The minutes from a meeting 4 months ago showed a vote to approve a new fine structure for fence violations. The vote passed 3-2. But when I cross-referenced the attendance log, one of the yes votes came from a board member who was not listed as present at the meeting. That meant the vote happened without a quorum, and the entire enforcement waive was invalid. I called Marcus immediately and told him what I found. He said that was exactly the kind of thing he was worried about, and he asked if I had checked the other meeting minutes for similar discrepancies. I said I was going through them now. By the end of the night, I had found 3 more votes that happened without proper quorum, including the vote to hire the attorney who sent me the demand letter. The HOA had been operating illegally for months, and nobody had noticed because nobody was checking the records. I printed everything and added it to my binder. The twist came 2 days later when I got a call from Ellen, the board member who had pushed to table the hearing. She said she needed to talk to me off the record, and she asked if we could meet for coffee. I agreed, and we met at a diner near the neighborhood. Ellen was nervous. She said she had been on the board for 2 years and had started noticing inconsistencies in how Susan handled enforcement cases. She said Susan had been pushing the board to adopt stricter rules and faster fine schedules, and she always had a list of homes she wanted to target. Ellen said she had asked Susan multiple times to provide documentation for her claims, and Susan always deflected or said the information was confidential. Ellen said she voted to table my hearing because she was starting to suspect Susan was making things up. I showed Ellen the meeting minutes with the quorum violations. Her face went white. She said she had never looked at the minutes that closely, and she had trusted Greg and Susan to keep accurate records. I said someone had been altering the minutes after the meetings, and I had proof. Ellen said if that was true, the board needed to act immediately, and she would push for an emergency meeting. I thanked her and asked if she would be willing to testify if this went to court. She said yes. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, and I was invited to attend as a homeowner with a pending complaint. The meeting was held at the clubhouse again, and this time the room was packed. Word had spread through the neighborhood that something big was happening, and at least 20 homeowners showed up. Susan was already seated when I arrived, and she had her rolled-up survey map on the table like always. She did not look at me. Greg opened the meeting by saying the board had received serious allegations regarding enforcement procedures and meeting record accuracy. He said the board had hired an independent auditor to review the records and that the results would be shared tonight. The auditor was a woman named Rachel, and she stood up and gave a 10-minute presentation. She confirmed that multiple board votes over the past year had occurred without a proper quorum, that several fine entries in the ledger did not match the enforcement logs, and that at least 4 meeting minutes had been edited after the fact with no notation or approval. She said the alterations appeared to be deliberate and that she had referred her findings to the HOA's insurance carrier and legal counsel. Susan tried to interrupt, but Greg told her to wait. Rachel continued and said the most significant finding was that the fence fine structure I had been charged under was invalid because the vote to adopt it never happened legally. That meant every fence fine issued in the past 4 months was void. The room erupted. People started shouting questions, and I saw at least 3 homeowners pull out their phones to take notes. Greg banged his hand on the table and called for order. I raised my hand and asked if I could submit additional evidence. Greg said yes. I walked to the front of the room and handed him the USB drive with the doorbell footage. I said the recordings showed the social committee chair trespassing on my property and making threatening statements about enforcement. I also said I had text messages where she demanded payment using language that suggested personal retaliation rather than legitimate HOA business. Greg plugged the USB into his laptop and played the clips on the projector. The room went silent. You could hear Susan's voice clearly on the video, saying I was going to regret ignoring the rules, and that she was going to make sure I paid every fine. When the clips ended, Greg looked at Susan and asked if she had anything to say. Susan stood up and said the recordings were taken out of context, and that she was performing her duties as a committee chair. She said homeowners did not have the right to question her methods, and that the board had given her full authority to document violations however she saw fit. Greg said that was not accurate and that the board had never authorized trespassing or personal harassment. Ellen stood up and said she was calling for a vote to remove Susan from the social committee and from all enforcement activities pending a full investigation. The vote passed 4-1. Susan was the only no vote. Susan tried to argue, but Greg cut her off and said the decision was final. He said the board would be meeting with legal counsel to determine next steps and that all pending fines and enforcement actions were suspended pending review. He also said the board was adopting an enforcement checklist that limited tactics and required documentation of all measurements and site visits. That was the HOA consequence. The meeting ended, and people started filing out. I stayed behind to talk to Ellen and Greg. Ellen thanked me for bringing the evidence forward and said she had no idea how bad things had gotten. Greg apologized and said the board had failed in its oversight responsibilities. He said my fence fines would be refunded in full, and the HOA would reimburse my survey costs and contractor fees as part of the settlement to avoid litigation. I asked what would happen to Susan. Greg said the board was requiring her to step down from the social committee immediately, and she would not be allowed to participate in any enforcement activities going forward. He said the board was also considering a formal vote to remove her from all committees, but that would require a homeowner petition. I said I would start the petition, and 3 other homeowners who had been fined under the same invalid structure said they would sign it immediately. 2 weeks later, I was standing in my backyard with my daughter, and she was running around near the new fence with a soccer ball. The fence was solid and exactly where it was supposed to be, and nobody was going to make me tear it down. My phone buzzed, and I saw an email from the management company. The subject line said, "Final resolution and reimbursement." I opened it and saw a check amount for the full refund of my fines, plus reimbursement for the survey and raise install costs. The email also said the board had formally adopted the enforcement checklist and that Susan had submitted her resignation from all HOA rules, effective immediately. She could not spin it. I forwarded the email to Marcus and thanked him for his help. He texted back and said he was glad it worked out and that he was still reviewing the full ledger because he suspected there were more problems beyond just my case. I told him to keep digging. The real payoff came 3 weeks later. I got a call from Ray, my contractor. He said he had just gotten a weird call from a tow company asking him to authorize a vehicle removal from a job site, and when he asked for details, the dispatcher said the request came from Susan and that she claimed Ray's truck was illegally parked in a common area during a fence install. Ray said he told the dispatcher he had never met Susan. The install was finished weeks ago, and he was not authorizing anything. The dispatcher said the tow company policy required authorization from the property owner or the contractor, and since Ray refused, the tow was not happening. Ray said the dispatcher also mentioned that Susan had called the same company 4 times in the past month trying to get vehicles towed without proper authorization, and the company had flagged her account as a problem caller. That was the payback vector, a tow vendor refusing to act without proper authorization. I laughed and told Ray that was perfect, and he said he figured I would want to know. The funny karma moment happened at the next board meeting. Susan showed up even though she had resigned, and she sat in the back row with her rolled-up survey map. During the public comment period, a homeowner asked the board to clarify the fence setback requirements because there was still confusion in the neighborhood. Greg said the requirement was 2 feet from the property line, measured from the surveyed boundary. Susan stood up and said that was wrong, and she pulled out her survey map and unrolled it on a chair. She started reading from a section she had highlighted, and she confidently cited Section 12, subsection 4, which she said required a 4-foot setback for any fence taller than 5 feet. Greg let her finish, and then he calmly said that Section 12, subsection 4, was about tree removal, not fences, and that the fence setback was covered in Section 9, subsection 2. The room erupted in laughter. Susan looked at the map again, her face going red, and then she rolled it up and walked out. Karen confidently read the wrong rule section out loud. It was perfect. I ran into Susan one more time, about a month later, in the parking lot of a grocery store. She saw me and turned to walk the other way, but I called her name. She stopped and looked at me. I did not say anything about the fines or the hearing or the resignation. I just said, make it public. I love watching people get embarrassed. Her face went white, and she walked to her car without a word. That was her boomerang line coming back. The final showdown happened 4 months after the emergency meeting. I was at the county courthouse for an unrelated inspection permit issue, and I ran into Greg in the hallway. He said the board had just finished a settlement conference with their insurance carrier regarding the enforcement audit, and the carrier had agreed to cover the cost of refunding all invalid fines from the past year. He said the total was over $30,000, and the board was sending letters to every affected homeowner. He also said the board had voted to adopt a new policy requiring third-party review of all enforcement actions over $100, which effectively ended the kind of fast-track harassment Susan had been running. I thanked him, and he said the board owed me for forcing the issue. As we were talking, I saw Susan walking down the hallway toward us. She was carrying a folder and looked like she was heading into a different courtroom. When she saw me, she stopped. I pulled the rolled-up survey map I had been carrying for a meeting out of my bag and laid it flat on a bench between us. I did not say anything. I just pointed to the property line and the setback measurements, all clearly marked. Susan stared at the map and her jaw tightened. Greg stood beside me and said the board had confirmed my fence was fully compliant and that all related enforcement actions were closed. Susan looked at both of us, and for a second I thought she was going to argue, but then her face just drained. She turned and walked away without a word. That was the final boundary line showdown, where I laid the survey on the hood of a car, except it was a courthouse bench, and Karen could not argue anymore. The HOA reimbursed my survey costs and contractor fees 3 weeks later. Marcus finished his ledger audit and found that Susan had been involved in at least 12 other enforcement cases where fines were issued without proper documentation, and the board quietly refunded all of them. The neighborhood group chat exploded with people sharing their own stories of bogus fines and intimidation, and a recall petition started circulating to remove the remaining board members who had enabled Susan's tactics. I signed it. My daughter and I spent the rest of the summer in the backyard. The fence stayed exactly where it was, solid and legal, and nobody bothered us. I still see Susan around the neighborhood sometimes, but she does not make eye contact. The rolled-up survey map is gone. The keyring does not jingle anymore. She keeps her head down and walks fast, and that is exactly how it should be. Thanks for watching, and I appreciate you listening.